And a few facts on today's topic has become kind of my, like to give a few preface historical facts, things you might not know about what we're talking about today. Earl will bring the knowledge and I'll bring the levity to the situation. And about researching today's topic, it was a little fine line, but I found some interesting facts on marijuana itself. But the first recorded use of marijuana as a medicinal drug occurred in 2737 BC by Chinese Emperor Shen Nung. Am I right, Earl? The emperor documented the drug's effectiveness in treating the pains of rheumatism and gout. And in our country, the first law in American colonies regarding marijuana was a 1619 law that actually required farmers to grow the hemp plant. And once harvested, it was used for clothing and sails and rope, so it was actually a requirement. Marijuana was then first severely restricted as a recreational and medicinal drug in the U.S. by the Marijuana Act of 1937. The law did not prohibit marijuana use, but imposed such a heavy tax that legal sale became nearly impossible. In October 1937, to follow up on that act, Samuel Caldwell was the first U.S. citizen arrested under that act for selling marijuana without paying the heavy burden of the tax. And lastly, prior to its ban, hemp was a staple cash crop of the family farm in early America, and the first two drafts of the United States Declaration of Independence were written on paper made of hemp. Strange. And with that, Representative Earl Blumenauer.
Well, thank you, Zach. I think that basically says it all. I appreciate your reference to hemp. We actually had two amendments passed in the House of Representatives last Thursday that were designed to have the federal government not interfere with the cultivation of hemp. I think it's kind of a metaphor for some of the challenges we face. I have, in my files I use occasionally, a picture of a hemp plant that is about 15 feet tall that was growing on the site of the Pentagon. During World War II, the United States government was actively urging hemp cultivation. Because the hemp fiber, the hemp has many applications. You can go to Saturday markets and street fairs and you can buy perfectly legal hemp products. You can have hemp ice cream, hemp. So it has a product where the fiber can be twisted into a rope that is particularly resistant to salt water. And during World War II, there was great concern about the Japanese incursion into the Philippines, which had been our source of this rope, sisal. And so we were urging people to cultivate it here in the United States. Today, we have all these perfectly legal hemp products, but Kentucky hemp farmers can't grow hemp. Can't grow it, cultivate it here in Oregon. We have to import it. Even though, as virtually everybody knows, you can't smoke enough hemp to create any sort of a high, maybe hurt your lungs, but this has been caught up in some of the bizarre implications of what we've been in the middle of for over 40 years, a pretty aggressive war on drugs with very mixed results, huge costs. And in one area, I think we have an utterly failed policy dealing with marijuana. Now, I have been coming to McMinnville since 1969 on one campaign or another. The very first one was a campaign to lower Oregon's voting age. I think it was Mark Cushing, who at that point was president of the high school. I interacted over the years with Jeb Bladine and Phil Bladine before him. And I love the feel of the community. I went to debate tournaments at McMinnville, at Linfield. We'd look forward to that every year. And I still look forward to opportunities to be here and watch. We were just talking how McMinnville has just blossomed. You're not just coming here for nicks anymore. Lots and lots of choices and the integration into the broader community. Well, back in the day, I was a child legislator, and I heard what I think was the single most compelling speech that may ever have been given on the floor of the Oregon House of Representatives. It was given by a guy who I thought was really old at the time. He may have been 57 or 59. He was a self-described conservative pig farmer, Republican from Eastern Oregon. An amazing man, somebody I grew a deep friendship with, and his wife, Stafford Hansel. Stafford was a staunch conservative, Republican, legislative leader, and he carried a bill on the floor in almost exactly 41 years ago this week that would have legalized 2 plants of marijuana for personal consumption. Now, I don't know that there's any of you here old enough to remember Stafford, or you ran in political circles. Stafford didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't use strong language. And he got on the floor and he picked up a cigarette. I don't know that he'd ever held a cigarette before. And he described something that was powerfully addictive, killed 400,000 Americans a year, and is perfectly legal to purchase over the counter. Then he slapped down a bottle of Jack Daniels, and I'm not certain he'd ever held that before. And he described how alcohol was involved with, at those days, drunk driving was a huge menace. It was not, we hadn't taken it as seriously as we should as a society. There were some 40,000 people a year killed in drunk driving incidents. And he went on to describe how for some people who the body chemistry makes alcohol a lethal combination. They become absolutely addicted to it. They become alcoholics, and problems with cirrhosis of the liver. How many people ended up dying every year because of alcohol. Perfectly legal. And then he picked up a marijuana cigarette, which I'm darn sure he'd never held before, and described how it had certain properties. To the best of anybody's knowledge at that point, it had never killed anybody, wasn't as addictive, and wasn't as damaging to the health. And Stafford made a point that why in the world aren't we legalizing and taxing it? Why do we treat people with criminal penalties? I'm told that if those of us who voted with Stafford that day, voted yes, had been joined by the people who voted no but smoked dope, that it would have passed. And that Oregon would have been on its way to being the first state to legalize adult use of marijuana. As it was, that legislative session, we were the first state in the union to decriminalize marijuana. And I think that's an important step forward. We've had wild variations around the country about how we enforce the prohibition. Even today, when there are allegedly more tolerant attitudes towards marijuana, when many states have joined Oregon in decriminalizing it, where it's the equivalent of a traffic ticket, essentially, for a small amount, we are still arresting between 2/3 and 3/4 of a million people a year for something that is tried by millions of Americans every month. And surveys tell us 58% of the Americans think should be legal. if you ask that question a little differently, regardless of whether you think marijuana use should be legal or not, should the federal government interfere with what states like Washington or Colorado do, or the 22 states and the District of Columbia that have made medical marijuana legal, most, by the way, with a vote of the people? Do you think the federal government should interfere with that? And then that percentage goes up to well over 2/3 who say, no, federal government shouldn't be interfering. But nonetheless, the prohibition on marijuana continues to be one of the cornerstones of our war on drugs that costs $50 billion a year, and it has led to our jails and prisons to be filled with people in the main who are not violent felons. When you combine this with the 3 strikes and you're out and the real get tough on sentencing, what we've done is we have dramatically shifted in Oregon public expenditures. In the old days, when I was that child legislator, we spent twice as much on higher education as we did on corrections. Now we're looking at, 4%? We've gone from state universities to state-supported universities to where now they're located in the state. And that is connected to these changes in patterns of enforcement, particularly at the lower end of the spectrum. It is an area that has produced major, significant social unrest and discrimination. If you're a young African American male, you are 4 times more likely to be arrested than your white male counterpart. And in some parts of Louisiana, you're 17 times more likely to be in jail for it. And if you're a person of color and poor, that arrest record can have a dramatic destabilizing effect on your job prospects, on your marriage prospects, on where you are in society, in ways that I don't think are particularly constructive. I have on my website, I'm not going to give you lots of facts and figures here, but I put together a little report, I call it the Path Forward, where I just spent time late last year just kind of writing down everything I thought about the issue, because I've been involved with it for 40 years. And it was instructive for me to do, and I invite you to look at it on my website, because a lot of what people think about marijuana really needs to be reassessed, recalibrated. It is a Schedule I narcotic drug. This was part of President Nixon's war on drugs. It was established in 1970. A Schedule I drug is the most dangerous and by definition has no therapeutic aspects. According to federal statute, marijuana is as dangerous as heroin and LSD and is more dangerous than cocaine and meth. Well, tell that to people in rural and small town America that are seeing a meth epidemic turn their communities upside down. It's time that we have a reality check and try and get these elements straight. Now, people tell me, well, what's the rush? You know, let's wait and see what the experiment is looking like in Colorado or Washington. You know, we've waited 42 years. What if we wait another 4 or 5? The point is that this train has already left the station. I mentioned there are 22 states in the District of Columbia that have legalized medical marijuana. There are over 1 million people who have legal access to medical marijuana across the United States. And frankly, I've met with families who talk about what difference it made for them to have access to medical marijuana. That patient who was dealing with chemotherapy, and the use of marijuana helped them endure and get well. The impact that it has on veterans with PTSD, multiple sclerosis. I was at OHSU a couple of months ago talking to researchers and pediatric surgeons, neurologists rather, about their patients, little kids, infants, babies who have severe epilepsy, violent, repetitive seizures. They were telling me that for these families, some of them have actually been able to get relief for these little children from this horrific condition using medical marijuana. We are seeing families relocate to different states to be able to treat their children. But the scientists and the doctors I talked to could not get access to marijuana to study it. Their patients could get marijuana easier to self-treat their children than the medical and scientific professionals to have access to marijuana to study it. This is crazy. And this is something we need to change now. In part because, contrary to a federal statute that says it has no therapeutic value, and I do appreciate, Zach, you're clarifying, this goes back in time. It has been used for thousands of years. And it works now, which is why voters in California and Oregon and Arizona have approved it. But we need to know what works and why. We need to be able to deal with the product. Research is not available because the DEA, with its head in the sand and misguided policies, doesn't allow access to marijuana for research purposes unless it's something that'll show how bad it is. That's the case. There's another real problem we have in this country, and that's young people dealing with drugs. There's research that talks about the danger of marijuana on the adolescent brain. I believe it. I don't want any teenagers using marijuana. But our policy of prohibition has completely failed. Do any of you think an 8th grader down the street is going to have a rougher time getting a joint than a 6-pack of beer? That marijuana dealer is not checking ID. He or she does not have a license to lose. And how easy is it for people who are, by definition, breaking the law to say, "Kid, you like that? I've got a pill I'd like to give you at a discount." Or maybe you try and smoke this. And our failure to deal honestly with this issue has undermined the authority of the people who are supposed to help us deal with illegal drugs. I had a high official with the President's Office of Drug Policy at a hearing right in front of me be unable to answer the question, what's more dangerous, methamphetamines or marijuana? Hello? Let me try again. How many people died of a marijuana overdose last year? Well, there were... I had the head of the National Institute of Health in a small, off-the-record setting, and I just try... I'm concerned about this. Sir, how many people died from a marijuana overdose? Well, he didn't think there were any. Wait a minute. If there was one, you'd know, because it'd be the first. And he could tell me how many people died of opiate overdoses, the abuse of prescription drugs, and heroin, and cocaine. But we have the highest officials being unable to be honest and candid. So if these people can't answer the question, marijuana more dangerous than cocaine? If they can't give a straight answer to that, how do we expect kids or anybody else to take them seriously? It undercuts their credibility. And we all need to be concerned about abuses of narcotics and prescription drugs and alcohol and tobacco. This is serious business. And we're wasting resources and we're confusing people. And we're not concentrating on the things we need to concentrate on. Marijuana is a very lucrative sideline for the Mexican drug cartels. The same way that Prohibition made the mafia, made Al Capone one of the richest, most powerful people in America. Marijuana prohibition is enriching some of the worst elements of society and international drug trafficking. And they're destabilizing Latin American governments. They are invading our forests in the Northwest to cultivate marijuana in some clearing the forest, polluting the water, using herbicides. And if you get too close to their areas, it can be very dangerous for you. Why do we empower and enrich those people? There are other goofy aspects here. You may have noticed that the marijuana businesses in Colorado are paying millions of dollars in taxes. How are they paying those taxes? In shopping bags full of $20 bills. Because our goofy laws make it illegal for them to have a checking account in a federally chartered financial institution. Well, let's think about this for a moment. If you care about money laundering, tax evasion, or just outright robbery, how smart is it to make hundreds of perfectly legal businesses operate on an all-cash basis? I don't think that's very smart at all. I could go on, but I won't, because I'm very interested in visiting with you. I'm interested in your thoughts and observations. This is an opportunity for us as a state to play a pivotal leadership role nationally. Because there are 2 states that have legalized adult use, and so there are now stories about what works and what doesn't. You know, there's some hiccups in Colorado. There's some things we want to look at in Washington. We are finding that there are people rushing into this space to start doing business. There are farmers in Oregon that are interested in growing hemp. There are people that want to do the research to be able to fully utilize the potential for medical marijuana. but to let people know the pros and cons and have standardized product. The Oregon election, and I think we're going to have a pretty good ballot measure that on the ballot this fall, a ballot measure that if it had been on the ballot 2 years ago would have passed. And we'll be part of this very spirited national discussion because people are going to look at Oregon. We're the next step. If it fails in Oregon, that's a whoa, what about that? If it passes in Oregon, the dam's going to break, and you're going to see a number of states following through. So what we do in Oregon is going to be very important. And what we learn from the experience, and how we can educate and research and do this right. It's also a test of whether we can take public policies that people know are kind of goofy, that waste money, waste lives, don't achieve their desired effect, and can we change them in a thoughtful, democratic fashion? When I was a high school student, just before I was a child legislator, we had a major epidemic of smoking, tobacco use in this country. Killed my father. I watched him die. Since I've been in high school, we have cut tobacco use in this country 2/3. It has saved millions of lives and hundreds of billions of dollars of health care costs. We didn't put people in jail. What we did is we were deeply involved with credible public education. We dealt with the product. We made safety changes to cigarettes. They weren't as deadly. And we taxed the dickens out of it. And that was particularly effective in reducing young people from smoking. We have an opportunity to turn a page, to have something that might work better, to deal with our objectives, save the taxpayer about $100 billion between the taxes that we'll collect and what we won't be spending, and hopefully show that we as a reasonable democratic society can actually solve problems, unlike Congress sometimes. I look forward to the opportunity to hear your comments, and if I have any questions you want to ask, I'd be happy to try and answer them. I saw the first arm in the back. If you just identify yourself and shout it out.
Great. I'm real pleased that you're so well informed, because you know things that I know but other people don't, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also my real interest today is what process it's going to take to get the money out of the prison system. Because you alluded to that, and my ear just perked right out.
Well,
Maybe that's another.
Let me touch on it lightly. It is another speech, but it is tied up with the war on drugs, because the prison population exploded, and we incarcerate more than anybody else in the world. It is disproportionate. The people that get locked up are poor and people of color. A huge number of them are non-violent drug offenders, users or low-level dealers, and the kingpins skate. It's created a prison industry in interesting ways. Legislatures would locate prisons in certain legislative districts that were losing population in rural America. So they wouldn't lose their state senator or their state representative because the people were counted as residents at the prison. There was an incentive to build the prisons and spread them out. They were some of them were privatized where private industry moved in there with just a vengeance. Look at the Prison Corporation of America, or whatever they're calling themselves these days, really lobbying for these strong sentences. And then in the state of California, you've got the Prison Guard Union, which is one of the most powerful political forces. And everything was moving towards more people locked up for longer. People doing life sentences under 3 strikes and you're out for stealing a couple cans of beer or a CD. We've got geriatric prisoners who are never going to commit a crime. And we've got wings of nursing homes. It's not only punitive and I think inhumane, but it's very expensive. If we're going to have an impact on somebody, a shorter sentence where we actually treat their addiction or we educate them is far more effective in many cases. It's not that there aren't some people that I want locked up forever. I agree with that. But most of them, no. And we need to sort of get our head around that. The number of children that are serving very long sentences. And part of what is so insidious about young people getting thrown into the adult prison system is that that's their graduate education. A lot of them were by no means hardened criminals when they went in, but they got involved with gangs for protection. They learned the tools of the trade. We didn't help them. And so when they get out, what are they going to do? What's their network? So I think it is another speech. It's another community conversation. But I'm pleased that the president is working now to deal with people who have these insanely long sentences that judges never would have inflicted, but Congress tied their hands. And we need that conversation here in Oregon as well. I want to protect my family as much as anybody else's, but I want to do it in a way that's smart and that doesn't destroy other families. Sure.
I'm wondering whether the news or whether Governor Kitzhaber has made public his view on the legalization issue.
I don't. I'm sure we can find out. Sir.
As a retired history educator, I appreciate your accurate references to the trends that have gone on, which makes this question, concurring with Susan, a repetitious one but valid. Did you inhale?
One of the reasons I have felt very comfortable taking a leadership role nationally is because evidently I was one of the few people in my generation who not only didn't inhale, but never tried to. I don't believe in it, but I will tell you that if I had a member of my family who it looked like marijuana would help with Parkinson's, MS, nausea, the epilepsy that I mentioned, I wouldn't hesitate for a moment to have them consult with a medical professional. But as I say, I watched a father die from cigarettes. I've had some experience with people who had problems with alcohol. I saw some kids who were pretty messed up with drugs, and it was just something that I was always very leery of. But I think in a sense that maybe helps me because there's no, how do I say this, smoking gun, it's, and if it becomes legal for recreational use, I have no intention of doing so. But I think it's a flawed policy that needs to be changed.
Where does most of the funding come from against the legalization? Like
Well, there are a number of people who sincerely disagree with this proposition, who feel we've got too many problems with alcohol now or tobacco. We don't need another legal drug. I respect that. I think that train's left the station, but I respect it. It's interesting that some of the criminal elements have been opposed to, for example, medical marijuana being more widely, because it cuts into their business. I am absolutely convinced that if we have more of these campaigns around the country, I wouldn't be surprised at all if illegal drug money got into campaigns and say, oh no, don't legalize this. Because it's their revenue stream. It's their easiest, cheapest way to make money. But there's a variety of people who don't agree with it, and I respect them. That's why we need to have a good, robust, fact-based public discussion. Yeah. Who are you? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have taken your campaign to local law enforcement agencies. I know our local one, particularly the Sheriff's Department, are very adamantly opposed to legalization. And I'm not sure I really understand why they want to keep that burden up,
Well, I mean, let me just speak generally. I mean, for 40 years, there has been a drug suppression movement. And people believe in it. That's their mission. That's why the president's head of DEA disagrees with him. She said the day that a hemp flag flew over the Capitol was the lowest point in her professional career. Whoa, I want to think about that for a moment, lady. But these are people who've been charged with enforcing the law, and they believe in enforcing the law. They've also been exposed to some very unsavory people who've been involved with drug traffic. And they've seen the underbelly. And they probably have skepticism that we'll do everything we need to do to take the other steps to protect our families. That's why we're proposing that we write into the law dedicated funding for more law enforcement, dedicated funding for education and research, and for treating addiction no matter what it is.
I think the underbelly would probably gradually disappear.
Well, some of it.
Yeah.
Some of it would.
The ones that are exposed to children and,
But they're sincere, they're earnest, they've seen tough things. But I've also, frankly, talked to prosecutors and law enforcement that say this is a fool's errand. We've got more important challenges. And this diverts resources and confuses the message. And they know, I think all of them know in their heart of hearts, that marijuana is not more dangerous than cocaine and methamphetamines. Sir?
Has there been any studies on the use of marijuana in driving?
Great point. The question, if you didn't hear it, was what do we know about the use of marijuana in driving? Have there been studies? There has been some research, and marijuana use can impair your driving. I don't want to be driving down the road with my family and have somebody coming at me who's high on marijuana. Two observations. The person who's high on marijuana, by all indications, is less dangerous than a person who's drunk. Much less likely to have road rage or, reckless and violent behaviors. I'm told by those in the know, including some emergency room docs, that they think drivers that smoke marijuana are more likely to kind of pull over to the side of the road or go get some munchies. One thing that we do know that is not well popularized, and it's information that needs to get out, is the combination of alcohol and marijuana is much worse than either of them apart. Several times worse. So that's part of why we've got to have open, honest conversation. We've got to be able to target law enforcement. We need better tests to be able to figure out what's in the system and what is impairment. But the legislation that we will be voting on includes a restriction against impaired driving. Doesn't change that. Right now, it's illegal to drive in Oregon or Colorado or Washington if you're impaired by marijuana. It's illegal now. It's an opportunity for us to try and educate the public, focus on changes, because there's so much misinformation or things that people just don't think about. I mentioned to you earlier, I'm absolutely committed to keeping this out of the hands of kids. The adolescent brain. You get a 13-year-old, marijuana affects the brain in its development. And I think we all more or less know that. I don't think we've talked about the impact of marijuana on the neonatal brain. That baby, before he or she is born. And we talked for a moment about how some people use marijuana to deal with the violent nausea of chemotherapy. Is it possible that someplace in America right now there is a woman suffering extreme morning sickness who might be doing a little self-medication? And have we thought about that? Have we reached out to be able to make the case that this isn't a very good idea, and to be able to do the research to show why it's wrong? So these are the sorts of things that we need to do a deep dive. I really appreciate your willingness to allow me to share some of my thoughts and observations with you today. Okay, you want the last word?
It's not the ballot. How likely is it that measure will be on the ballot this fall?
I think it's extremely likely. It's extremely likely. Actually, there are 3 ballots measures that are circulating. One's a constitutional amendment, which I think is really a bad idea. No matter what you think about marijuana, freezing a ballot measure into the Constitution, I think, is ill-advised. Because we're learning, right? We agree. We're going to learn from what's going on in Colorado and Washington. We in Oregon will adapt this to our own purposes. But to freeze it in the Constitution, pretty hard to adjust. Anyway, I think there is one that is very likely. There's an outside chance that another one would. Oregonians, I think, will be voting on this in the fall. I think I saw one last hand. Oh, the next to the last hand.
I just want to say I saw your back and forth exchange with the DEA representative, and my little opinion of the politician actually, well, question not to but my one question to you would be, are you a lone wolf? Or are you representative of the same opinions in Congress who aren't brave enough to come out and say that they're pro?
Well, most of the last 40 years, this has been a decidedly minority opinion. But it's changing. I mean, it started changing in 1996 when California approved medical marijuana, and Oregon did it 2 years later. I've been working in Congress on some legislation that really didn't quite move the last couple years, but that's part of why I wrote the report. I've worked with a number of people who have legislation. And I mentioned we had 3 amendments that were approved last Thursday, including the one on medical marijuana with 49 Republicans. Most of our legislation is bipartisan. It's starting to move. I think we are watching opinions not only shift in Congress, but we're finding more people who are willing to say so publicly. So I think in the next 5 years, particularly if Oregon passes our initiative in the fall, I think it's going to be game over. I think there'll be a number of states that will have legalized it. I think we will delist marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 2, or maybe delist it altogether. We will not be interfering with what states do. We'll treat it like alcohol. And we'll, I think, be better for it. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming today. Thank you for keeping the fight up for our freedom fearlessly. I've always had a question since I learned about the patent on the medical use of marijuana that the United States government holds. It seems like it immediately contradicts the Schedule 1 listing if our federal government actually owned the patent and has licensed it for use with GW Pharmaceuticals, an out-of-country company that's producing these medicines. Isn't that a huge piece of ammunition in your fight?
Yes.
I haven't heard it brought up in this setting or in any of your amazing debates that I've watched you take part in with the officials involved. How come it doesn't come to the forefront of the bazooka for you to blow them out of the water?
It seems to me that part of what I find when I'm making presentations or I'm in legislative hearings, part of the problem is that there is so much about the existing policy that is contradictory, self-defeating, wrong-headed, that you kind of don't know exactly how far to go.
It just seems like this is the core, and it erases all the petty stuff that is trying to be brought to the forefront, because they've already scientifically done the studies for years and had to prove medical use for epilepsy, stroke, all kinds of health, and they've held that for 10 years without letting it be used for anybody that we know that's ever had a stroke or epilepsy, and they own the patent. Patent 507 is what it's referred to a lot. It's a longer number, but anybody can look it up, and it's astonishing to me that it's not the ender to the whole conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be with you this afternoon.
Real quick before you go, good friend Earl Blumenauer, I wanted to give you this bag that we give everybody who comes and speaks for us. It's filled with, from what I understand, your next stop on your trip out here, a bottle of Sokolblosser wine and a lovely wine bag logoed with City Club logo. Just a few quick ones. You talked about Oregon being a pioneer of the opportunity, and I could just imagine if Oregon falls in line, how would McMinnville fall in line? And I could just see the little CSA bin now with farmers. So. This was a fantastic end to a fantastic season. I'm going to let you go. I just want you to know that over the summer we will still have City Club programs, but they'll just be at the bar. Upcoming next is Tuesday, June 17th, Made in America, the challenges and successes of bringing manufacturing back home. Local Nate Lindell, who has experience directly building the new Oakland Bay Bridge on that project. He's got some great insights, some great ideas, but we'll be doing those every month, and we'll be back in September. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next year.